Alright, hello, this is our next video in this river song tutorial on growing our sporeless oyster mushrooms. Quick background on this variety. This variety was produced by Sylvan, which is a mushroom company that goes back really far, over 100 years here in western Pennsylvania, Sylvan. And they have a strain called Spapo, which was found in the wild with a natural mutation that caused it to not produce spores. Perhaps some of the mechanisms of reproduction, for example the basidia, perhaps those developed in a certain wrong way which prevented any spores from developing there. That could possibly be it, but I'm actually interested in learning more about the actual mechanisms that cause that. But at any rate, that's Spapo. And they have another variety that was Spapo, which they then developed further by breeding with other oyster mushrooms. Not exactly sure how they did that, but I'm interested to learn more about that. But so that variety is SPX281. So we've been growing out both side by side, the original and the modified, or the process of breeding is you combine the two mushrooms together and see what different varieties it produces, and then you keep the ones that you like, and then you keep repeating that until you get a really nice one. So Spapo and SPX281. So this is an example of Spapo. So let's take it from the top, how to cut it open and fruit it. So, okay, this is the same bag as the lion's mane from earlier because I did not bring out a new oyster mushroom grow kit to fruit. But what you're going to want to do is, I use an X-Acto knife. You can also use a clean kitchen knife as long as it's sharp or something of that nature. I take isopropyl alcohol. You take rubbing alcohol, anything to sanitize it, or one of those little sanitizing alcohol wipes, something like that. Just clean it off, let it dry, and then reduce it to the lowest setting to give you an indication of how deep you want to cut. And then for the lion's mane, what we did was we side cut it, and we made one slice, about 4 inches, 3.5, 4.5, something like that, 4 inches slice. Okay, with oyster mushroom, I would recommend making an X rather than just one diagonal slash. So hopefully you can see that X there. And you just want to make sure it's cut through all the way. You want to cut in just about that much into the substrate, just the lowest setting on the box cutter. And alternatively, instead of one X, you can cut another X on the other side, so you can fruit 2 clusters. And with this particular variety, because it's a commercial variety, it's very strong and produces a lot, so that would probably be a really good thing to do, is to make a cut on either side. But I personally with these have not done that yet, but I'm sure you'd have a good time with it. Another alternative to cutting an X would be cutting a U, or like a smiley face slice, because that format of exposing the substrate provides a nice humid environment inside that cut, in that formation, so that the primordia that forms, the pins that will form along that U, form very nicely and prominently. So you can cut the U, or cut an X, or cut 2 X's or 2 U's. But however, I would recommend also safety first, when you're not using the box cutter, always close it so you don't get hurt. You want to use caution in exposing too much of this substrate to fresh air. If you expose too much, for example, if you were to take the substrate bag clearly out of substrate block all the way out of the plastic, that would expose the whole block. Certain strains, like certain species of mushrooms like shiitake and enoki, will actually produce the same size mushroom all over the block, wherever you cut it. It doesn't matter. It's very prodigious in its growing manner. So lion's mane and oyster mushroom, however, you don't want to cut that much because then you'll end up with a lot of really small fruiting bodies and risk the substrate drying out and just not growing as good. So keep that in mind. So we are going to, for this example, discuss fruiting it from one cut growing upwards. And we'll explain how to modify it if you're growing it from the sides. So the X is facing upwards. We're going to get some paper towel. I took a paper towel, you can take two, whatever, roll it up, moisten it. By the way, spray bottle, these are $1 or $2 at Walmart. Just use any spray bottle, just make sure it's clean. You don't want to use a spray bottle that had bleach in it right before that and not cleaned out properly. Yeah. So, paper towel, you're gonna pop it on either side, somewhere, on any sides, front, behind, wherever, of the substrate bag. You're going to want to take the humidity tent included in the kit, and you want to make a couple cuts or incisions, maybe near the top, to allow some fresh air to enter that environment where you're growing out the substrate bag, fruiting bodies. These grow bags will accommodate a large plenum or space for air, but they can also be just folded up to be a smaller size to better hug the substrate block. So at the beginning, it's totally fine to have it hug the substrate because more than fresh air right now, it wants humidity. Those were possibly in Yoda's terminology. The substrate, the mycelium located at that substrate cut there, the cut in the substrate, it wants humidity and some fresh air, but it's already getting that fresh air, enough fresh air for its circumstance. And it wants a nice humid environment to grow its primordia, the beginnings of the mushrooms. So you do want some fresh air, so make some cuts from the beginning, put the paper towels in. Whenever you get a chance, whenever it seems to dry out on the inside of the plastic, you want to mist the inside and also mist the cut. Okay. And at this point, it's all set up and ready to go. Did I cover soaking? No, I did not. Okay, sorry folks, let's backtrack one moment. I skipped a step. And my editing skills are non-existent for videos right now, so I apologize, but I'm sure I will revise this video soon with actual editing where I, can do things in sequential order. But, so going back, once you make the cut in the substrate bag and expose that substrate there, that mycelium there, to fruiting conditions, the fresh air, first thing we're going to want to do is soak it in just a little bit of water. So get a clean dish or plate or bowl or something like that that can hold about this much water, and then put the cut down into that water and soak it for an hour or two. I would not go too crazy with this soak. I would just do an hour or two just to help hydrate that area right where you made that cut. And then pull it out of the water and try to get the excess water that might be trapped up in there. Try to get that out, do your best. If you can see it's trying to get out but the plastic is too tight, you could try to pull the plastic up, but you don't want to dig your dirty fingernails into the substrate and risk just getting it contaminated or something like that. So not that contamination is much of an issue at this point now that the substrate is completely colonized, but you don't want to try to avoid touching it directly with your fingers, the substrate. But you could use perhaps the knife or something to lift it up. And you can also do that more liberally right at the beginning once you make that cut and the soak and that time. Rather than a week later, you wouldn't really want to keep messing with the flaps because then little primordia might be trying to grow there, but flick, now it got destroyed while you tried to lift up the plastic. So you can mess with the plastic first couple days a little bit, make sure it's actually, the substrate is exposed to air somewhat, not so flush against it. Flush against it is okay, but there's a certain flush against the substrate that makes it seem like it has never been peeled up. So sorry if those words were enigmatic, but the idea is soaking it for an hour. Drain as much as you can. Just always try to avoid any standing water, pooling water, because that can promote anaerobic growing environments for anaerobic bacteria to grow. If you made 2 cuts, I would just go ahead and do that for the other cut, an hour or 2 soak on that side. And then now we'll resume back to where we were in our growing instructions using the humidity tent. So for the oyster mushrooms here, once you see little mushroom pins forming, at that point you are going to want to consider, put this back on. So during the first week, give or take, could take 2 weeks, could take just a couple days, the warmer, the faster it grows. The colder, the more deeper the colors and the denser the fruiting body, but the slower it'll grow. So whether you grow it in a warm environment, cold environment, as long as you're not growing below 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and if you're not growing above 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so we've been checking this for, daily, and just anytime it dries out, spray it with some more water. Make sure that the paper towels are still moist. Those are an indicator of humidity, and they also provide ambient humidity inside the tent. So we're doing that for a week or so, give or take. And then you see little pins, mushroom pins, starting to form along that cut. Okay? Now you're going to ask yourself the question, how much fresh air can I afford to provide these mushroom pins? How much fresh air can I afford to provide it? That all depends on the ambient humidity of your growing environment. So here in Western Pennsylvania, right now it's summertime, so the ambient humidity is generally 60%, even up to 70 or 80% some days, so it's summertime and it's very humid out. So I don't even need this bag for the pinning stage or at all, really, although I always do recommend it anyways during the first couple days just to get the pins to form, because it just really helps provide that nice, stable, humid environment. There's no chance of a wind blowing and kind of drying it out a little or anything like that occurring. But now that the pins have formed, how much fresh air can we afford to those mushrooms? Oyster mushrooms, and there are some exceptions to this, but oyster mushrooms are prized for their caps, not for their stems. So the exceptions to that are king trumpet and black king pearl and enoki, perhaps Pio. There are some examples of mushrooms where you want a long pronounced stem and you don't need much of a cap. But this kind of oyster mushroom, traditional oyster mushrooms, are prized for their caps. So the bigger the caps, like a mosquito, come after me, fly. So the bigger the caps and the smaller the stems, typically the better. When you're cooking the caps, they're going to have a more edible texture, softer and just better, easier to deal with. Whereas the stems of oysters can tend to be a little rubbery and chewy. So whenever you're cooking, you typically want to cut wherever the gills finally end, right at that base of the stem. Then you could use the stems for something else. Someone mentioned cutting it finer and cooking it in a soup type thing. I'm not sure, I would follow up with that, but that was a little tangent to illustrate the need for fresh air exchange to the growing oyster mushroom fruiting bodies. So now that the little mushroom pins have formed, what I'm going to do is try to judge how much fresh air I can get to it. So I'll take scissors and cut away parts of this grow bag, thus allowing more fresh air in. If you cut too much off, or if you take it off entirely, especially if it's winter or very dry, you're in Arizona, Tucson or Phoenix, something like that, then it might yellow the mushrooms. They'll look dry. They'll just be slower growing. So use your discretion, but try to get as much fresh air as you can to get those nice big caps. If you see it really reaching then that means that it wants more fresh air, and you're going to be getting it more stemmy. Okay. I'll also note that in this regard of allowing more fresh air or less fresh air to the growing fruiting body, the lion's mane is a bit more forgiving than the oyster. What I've found is that if I've left the lion's mane growing up in there, and I just had little holes up here, it was not much fresh air, the lion's mane would start growing like a coral, and I would think, oh no, they're going to be too, it's going to change the consistency because they're deprived of fresh air, and so they're not going to be that nice traditional lion's mane shape and morphology. However, once I took off the humidity tent on the lion's mane at that point, that very same lion's mane, it pom-pommed out because now it had fresh air. So it's more forgiving than oyster mushrooms. Oyster mushrooms, from my experience, if you let them grow up in this and they're reaching for that fresh air, and then you try to remediate that, they'll always seem to have that very pronounced stem. And so the earlier on that you can catch that and provide it with more and more fresh air, the better for these oyster mushrooms. So those are some factors that you're going to want to play with. One other interesting thing I wanted to show in this video is some of the different stages. So this is an example. This is our 4.5 pound grow bag, and these mushrooms have been top fruited. This is the spot bow, and these I'll let grow for another probably week or another 3 days depending. Okay, this is a very fascinating specimen. This is spot bow, and this is our 9.5 pound grow bag. So check out these caps. This was side fruited, meaning it grew out like this. It was sitting and growing out the side. Because it does not produce spores, you can let it grow up in this crazy fashion, just totally overgrown, without the risk of it dumping spores. Any other oyster mushroom, a traditional mushroom in general, at this point would release so many spores you would see oftentimes that white powder on the table around it. And you don't really want to be breathing that in. You don't want to just be letting a mushroom grow and get overgrown in your house. It's just going to be releasing spores for no reason. Typically they are considered tastier if you harvest them before this point, but they do keep growing bigger, so you could consider playing around with that. But I'd be interested to hear if at this point, if people find it to be more bitter or less appetizing, or you have to cook it different than if you were to harvest this, say, a week or a few days prior. But yeah, these have completely curved up. You can barely even see the top of the caps. And I don't see any powder anywhere around where it's growing out. So that is one advantage of growing out the sporeless oyster mushroom. As with the lion's mane, once you harvest the cluster, and I should note that none of those oysters were grown with a humidity tent. I did not actually use this for any of those. All I did was spray them once a day, twice a day, once every couple of days. It was pretty infrequent when I would spray those. However, it is humid, Western Pennsylvania, in the summertime. So if it was winter, I would definitely need some sort of humidification like this. Once you harvest the mushroom cluster, you can refruit from that same spot by just repeating that process of taking that cut and soaking it in a clean dish with just maybe an inch or less than an inch of water, just enough to get that cut saturated. Then shake out that water, do that for whatever other cuts, if there's more than one, and just refruit it from that same opening, or, which is what I typically do, or you could close off that original opening and fruit it from, say, the opposite side. You could also do something like fruit it for the first two fruitings from the same side, but then close that off, either with tape or just perhaps the plastic folding in on itself would be sufficient. Use your discretion there, but you just want to restrict the fresh air from that original cut. If, let's say, on the third flush, you maybe then do from the alternate side of the block. So you can play around with it that way. And then you would expect to see some activity within a week or two of mushroom pins starting to grow back. Typically, each subsequent flush produces less mushrooms. However, if your first flush is not that much mushrooms, not that much weight, do not despair, because sometimes that just means that the next flush, it just has more power left in it to produce more mushrooms subsequent flushes. So sometimes there's a massive second flush. But typically, if it's done right, the first flush is big and then smaller flushes after that. It can keep doing that flush after flush until, if you find mold, green mold, black mold, then chuck it outside in the garden and just, take it out of the plastic and then, put it in the garden. If you leave it whole, then mushrooms can continue possibly fruiting from that, or you could bury it whole, or you could break it up and mix it in with something. You can play around with that, but if you're ordering multiple species, I would just keep them separate so that their mycelium don't have to compete over the same resources. You can consider that. I think that pretty much covers it. Yeah. Happy growing, and reach out with any questions or anything like that. Take care.